There is a moment that captures John Bell Hood better than any biography has managed to do in a single sentence. It is the autumn of 1863, and Hood is being lifted onto his horse by two soldiers, one holding each side because he cannot mount it himself. His right arm hangs at his side, largely useless since a bullet at Gettysburg shattered the nerves and left the limb functional in appearance only. His right leg is gone entirely below the hip, taken off on a field table at Chickamauga 17 days after the battle, after the wound had festered beyond saving. A leather strap goes around his remaining leg and under the saddle, anchoring him to the animal so that he will not fall if he loses consciousness or loses his balance in the chaos of combat. He is 32 years old, and he is going back to war. What kind of man does that? What combination of ambition, conviction, physical courage, and something that might reasonably be called recklessness pushes a person to strap themselves to a horse and ride back into battle when their body has already paid that price twice? John Bell Hood spent his entire adult life answering that question, and the answer he gave, through the way he lived and the way he commanded, tells you something about both the extraordinary promise and the catastrophic failure that define his place in American military history. He was, by most accounts of the men who served under him and the generals who observed him, among the most gifted combat officers produced by either side in the Civil War, at the level where such officers are most useful, leading men in the attack, holding ground under fire, making split-second decisions in the violence of a tactical engagement. Robert E. Lee loved what Hood could do with a brigade and a clear objective. Jefferson Davis promoted him, trusted him, and believed in him past the point where the evidence suggested he should. And then, in the summer of 1864, both of them made the decision that would expose the sharp and permanent gap between what Hood was capable of at one level of command and what he was asked to do at a level where the skills that had made him extraordinary became the same qualities that produced catastrophe. This is the story of one of the most complicated figures in the whole of the Confederate War, a man who was, simultaneously, a legitimately great combat officer and one of the worst army commanders of the 19th century. And it begins not in Virginia or Georgia or Tennessee, but in the rolling hills of Bath County, Kentucky, where John Bell Hood was born in 1831. He did not come from a military family in the formal sense, though his father was a physician of some standing in the community, and the family was prosperous enough to provide him with the kind of education that led, in the end, to a West Point appointment in 1849. Hood at West Point was not a distinguished student by academic measure. He graduated 44th in a class of 52, which put him solidly in the lower third of his cohort. What West Point produced in Hood was not scholarly achievement, but relationships, among them a close friendship with a young Virginian named James Longstreet, who would become one of the most important people in Hood's military career, and a general comfort with the physical demands of military life that suited his temperament far better than the academic ones. His early career took him west, to infantry service in California, and then to Texas with the 2nd Cavalry, the regiment that had been deliberately stocked with some of the most talented officers in the pre-war army. Albert Sidney Johnston commanded it. Robert E. Lee served as lieutenant colonel. William Hardy was there. Kirby Smith. George Thomas. John Bell Hood arrived as a second lieutenant and found himself learning the trade of frontier war under men who would become, within a decade, either the senior generals of the Confederacy or its most dangerous Union opponents. He was wounded in a skirmish with Comanche warriors along the Devil's River in 1857. A minor wound, but a first data point in what would become a pattern of personal physical exposure to combat that was unusual even by the standards of an era when officers led from the front. When the war came, Hood's path was direct. He resigned his commission and traveled to Richmond, where he was initially given a cavalry command in Kentucky. The assignment did not last long. Hood was transferred to infantry and given command of the 4th Texas Infantry, and it was there that his reputation was made. The Texas Brigade, the 4th Texas, the 1st Texas, the 5th Texas, and the 18th Georgia, was one of the hardest fighting formations in Lee's Army of Northern Virginia, and Hood made it so. He drilled the men relentlessly, demanded physical toughness, and led them into engagement after engagement in the Peninsula Campaign of 1862 with an aggressiveness that drew the attention of everyone who observed it. Gaines' Mill in June 1862 was the engagement that made Hood's name. The Army of the Potomac had built a defensive line on the Chickahominy River that had held against Confederate assault all afternoon, repelling attack after attack from units that went in hard and came back in pieces. Lee needed someone to break it before darkness fell and the tactical opportunity vanished. He sent for Hood. Hood took his brigade in on a direct assault at a dead run, crossing the creek under fire from multiple directions, pressing through the defensive line at the point where it was least reinforced, and turning what had been an afternoon of Confederate failure into a breakthrough that eventually unraveled the entire Union position. The cost was around 1,000 men. It was always high when Hood attacked. That had been true in Texas with the Comanche, and it was true on the Chickahominy, and it would be true at every engagement that followed. But Lee had watched the thing happen, had watched Hood go where other commanders had not gone and come out the other side with a broken Union line behind him. And what Lee saw was not simply a brave man. It was a specific kind of tactical instrument, one that Lee would reach for repeatedly over the next year whenever he needed something carried by force. What followed was a rapid series of promotions that moved Hood from brigade to division command and eventually to corps command, each step building a reputation for offensive aggressiveness that became his defining professional characteristic. At Second Bull Run, he drove his division through a gap in the Union line. At Antietam, his division held the Confederate left against repeated Union assault and then launched a counterattack that briefly stabilized a position that had been close to collapsing. The men who served under Hood in these months used the same words repeatedly in their accounts: aggressive, fearless, ferocious, willing to spend his own blood and theirs to take an objective. Some of them said it with admiration. A few said it with a particular quality that was not quite resentment, but was close to the exhausted respect of men who know their commander will spend them hard. Then came Gettysburg, July 2, 1863, and the assault on the Union left at the base of Little Round Top and across the jumbled boulders of Devil's Den. Hood had serious reservations about the attack as planned. He sent multiple messages to Longstreet, his corps commander, arguing that the approach should be modified, that the ground on the Confederate right allowed for a flanking movement that would put the Confederate attack in a far more advantageous position. The requests were denied. The orders came from Lee through Longstreet. The attack would proceed as planned, and Hood took his division forward into one of the most brutal terrain-dependent assaults of the war. Within minutes of the engagement beginning, a Union artillery shell burst above his arm, and the shrapnel tore through the nerves and blood vessels. He was carried from the field. The attack continued without him, and the Army of the Potomac held Little Round Top. The arm never fully recovered. Hood lost the functional use of it for the rest of his life, though the limb remained attached. He went back to command at Chickamauga in September 1863 because he would not stay away, and because the Confederate Army needed every experienced officer it had. At Chickamauga, he drove his division into the gap that opened in the Union line when a mistaken order pulled Brannan's division out of position, the gap that Thomas Wood's withdrawal created and that Longstreet exploited with a hammer blow that split the Army of the Cumberland in two. Hood was at the front of the assault, as he always was, and a rifle ball took him in the right leg just above the knee. He refused to be helped from the field initially, demanding to be kept upright on his horse long enough to see that the advance was continuing. He lost consciousness from blood loss. He was carried off. The leg was amputated 5 inches below the hip. He was 22 months into the war and had been seriously wounded twice. The rational military calculus, to say nothing of any personal one, suggested he had given what could be given. Hood spent months recovering in Richmond, where he was treated as a hero and became a fixture in the social world of the Confederate capital. It was during this period that he became deeply attached to Sally Buchanan Preston, the daughter of a prominent South Carolina family, known to everyone who mattered in Richmond as Buck. She was considered one of the great beauties of wartime Confederate society. Witty, socially adept, and apparently skilled at managing a series of admiring men with a combination of warmth and careful noncommitment. Hood proposed to her at least once during his recovery, and possibly more than once. She did not exactly say no. She also never said yes with the finality that would have ended the pursuit or begun the relationship in any clear terms. Mary Chestnut, the diarist whose account of Confederate Richmond society is one of the war's great primary documents, wrote about Hood and Buck Preston with the wry precision of someone watching a tragic comedy from the front row. Hood, she noted, wore Buck's photograph in his coat. He spoke of her with a directness that made other people in the room slightly uncomfortable. He was a man who had charged Union defensive lines with less evident anxiety than he brought to a Richmond drawing room in the company of a woman who wouldn't quite say yes. The ambiguity and Hood's determination to resolve it in his favor became a recurring subplot of his private life through the years of the war that followed, surfacing in letters and in the accounts of people who watched both of them navigate what neither of them seemed able to resolve cleanly. In the spring of 1864, he returned to the Army of Tennessee, commanding a corps under Joseph Johnston, who was retreating through northwest Georgia in front of Sherman's advance toward Atlanta. Johnston's strategy was deliberate and defensively sound. Trade space for time, inflict casualties on Sherman wherever the terrain allowed. Avoid the kind of pitched offensive engagement that would give Sherman's superior numbers the decisive advantage, and trust that the accumulating cost of the campaign would eventually erode Northern political will. It was a strategy that Sherman himself respected and found difficult to counter. It was also a strategy that Jefferson Davis found intolerable. Davis and Johnston had a relationship poisoned by years of personal animosity and professional disagreement that had begun before the war and calcified during it. Davis believed Johnston was too cautious, too willing to retreat, too protective of his army at the expense of the territory the Confederacy needed to hold. Johnston believed Davis was interfering in operational decisions that were none of his business, and that the President did not understand the tactical reality on the ground in Georgia. Both men were, in their own ways, partly right. The disconnect between them was irreconcilable. Johnston's retreat had covered nearly 100 miles of North Georgia over 3 months without a significant battlefield defeat, a remarkable operational record by any honest measure. But it had also surrendered ground that Davis did not believe could be surrendered. The Confederate president had been receiving reports from Braxton Bragg, whom he had sent to Georgia as his personal military advisor, suggesting that Johnston had no plan for halting the retreat and no intention of fighting for Atlanta in any decisive way. Johnston refused to share his operational intentions with Davis, citing the possibility of information leaks and maintaining a posture of professional autonomy that played very badly with a president who believed the general in the field served at the pleasure of the government in Richmond. The relationship deteriorated to the point where communication between them was essentially a series of increasingly cold official dispatches masking mutual contempt. In July 1864, as Johnston's army fell back to the fortified works on the immediate outskirts of Atlanta, Davis removed him from command and gave the Army of Tennessee to John Bell Hood. The appointment stunned a significant portion of the Confederate officer corps. Hardee, who was Hood's senior in the Army and had expected the command himself, was furious. Johnston's departure demoralized soldiers who had trusted his careful management of their lives. Longstreet, who knew Hood as well as anyone in the Confederate Army, warned when he heard the news that Hood was a bold fighter in a brigade and would try to fight the same way with an army. The warning was prescient, and it was ignored. What Davis wanted from Hood was exactly what Johnston had refused to provide: offensive action. He wanted Atlanta defended aggressively, wanted Sherman forced back, wanted the narrative of Confederate retreat reversed before the November election, made the retreat permanent by electing Lincoln to a second term. Hood understood what he had been given the command to do, and so, within days of taking command, he did it. He attacked. 3 times in the first week, at Peachtree Creek on July 20th, at Atlanta on July 22nd, at Ezra Church on July 28th, Hood sent his army forward in offensive assaults against Sherman's forces. The battles were costly, they produced no significant territorial gain, and after each one, the Army of Tennessee had fewer men and no better strategic position than before. At Peachtree Creek, a poorly coordinated assault that struck a Union force that had just crossed the creek hit the enemy at a moment of partial vulnerability, but was executed without the timing and concentration that might have made it work. At Atlanta, a complex flanking movement that required precise coordination between corps commanders operating on separated roads against a moving enemy produced initial success that could not be sustained. At Ezra Church, Confederate infantry attacked Union infantry that had already begun entrenching and paid the price that attacking entrenched infantry always paid in 1864. Total Confederate casualties in those 3 engagements across 8 days ran to somewhere between 12 and 15,000 men. Losses the Army of Tennessee could not replace. Sherman's losses were substantially lower. The attrition math was moving in exactly the wrong direction for the Confederacy, which was exactly what Johnston's strategy had been designed to prevent. Atlanta fell on September 2, 1864. Sherman occupied the city. Hood's army remained in the field southwest of the city, battered but intact as a formation, and Hood spent the weeks that followed working on a plan that he believed could restore the strategic situation in the Western Theater. The plan was bold in concept and disastrous in execution. He would move the Army of Tennessee north, cut Sherman's supply line from the rear, force Sherman to abandon Atlanta, and come after him, fight on ground of Hood's choosing, destroy Sherman's army, and then march north to threaten Kentucky and possibly Ohio. It was the kind of plan that looks in isolation like strategic imagination. In the context of an army that had just lost 15,000 men in a week and was fighting a Union force with a substantial numerical advantage, it was something closer to strategic fantasy. Sherman, rather than chase Hood through the North Georgia mountains as Hood had expected, made a different calculation. He sent George Thomas north to Tennessee with enough force to deal with Hood and turned his own army southeast towards Savannah in the campaign that would become the March to the Sea. Hood was now operating in Tennessee without his most dangerous opponent facing him, which should have been an advantage. What he was facing instead was a Union force under John Schofield that was working to reach the Nashville defenses before Hood could cut it off. Schofield nearly didn't make it. At Spring Hill on November 29th, Hood's army had the Union force in its grip, lying directly across the road Schofield needed to use to escape to the north, in a position where a determined night attack or a well-placed blocking force should have produced the Confederate victory the Tennessee campaign desperately needed. What happened at Spring Hill remains one of the most debated episodes of Confederate command failure in the entire war. The Union column marched north through the darkness on the pike that ran directly past Confederate positions. Some accounts say fires were lit near the road by Confederate soldiers who didn't understand the situation. Others describe orders that weren't relayed, commanders who weren't where they should have been, and a breakdown in the command communication that left Schofield's army passing within hearing distance of men who should have been blocking their path. By morning, Schofield was gone. He had made it through and was moving toward Franklin, 18 miles to the north, where his engineers were building pontoon bridges across the Harpeth River for the crossing to Nashville. Hood was enraged. He had ridden through the night, and the evidence suggests that his rage at the Spring Hill failure, which he blamed on his corps commanders and which his corps commanders blamed on him, had pushed him past the point where he was making clean operational calculations. He followed Schofield to Franklin and, at approximately 4 in the afternoon on November 30th, with 2 hours of daylight remaining and his supply train still miles behind, ordered the Army of Tennessee forward in a frontal assault across 2 miles of open ground against Union field works that Schofield's men had been building since morning. The assault at Franklin was one of the most savage tactical engagements of the entire war, and it looked it before the first man crossed the open ground. The Union field works stretched across the Columbia Pike at a position centered on the Carter House, a brick farmhouse that became the focal point of the Confederate assault almost by geographic coincidence. The ground in front of the Union line was largely open, the kind of open that gives a rifleman everything he needs and an attacker nothing. Men who walked it afterward noted that there was no cover of any meaningful kind for the 2 miles between the Confederate start line and the Union works. When the attacking columns stepped off in the late afternoon light, every man going forward could see exactly what he was walking into. 18 Confederate brigades went forward across that ground, moving into a volume of Union fire that survivors described in terms that suggested they had not fully believed it was possible beforehand. They broke through the Union center at a position called the Carter House, drove into the defensive line at a point called the Locust Grove Salient, and fought inside the Union works in some of the most brutal close-quarters combat recorded in any Civil War engagement. 6 Confederate generals were killed, a number without precedent in any single engagement on either side. 54 Confederate regimental commanders were killed or wounded. Total Confederate casualties in the 5-hour battle ran to approximately 6,500 men. Schofield's army, having held long enough to complete the crossing, withdrew during the night to Nashville. Franklin had cost the Army of Tennessee 1/5 of its remaining strength and gained nothing. Hood followed Schofield to Nashville and laid the Army of Tennessee across the approaches to the city, which was held by George Thomas with a force that eventually numbered roughly 50,000 men against Hood's 23,000. Thomas waited while he assembled his cavalry, organized his forces, and prepared a battle on his own terms. Hood waited because he had no real option. His army was too small to assault the Nashville defenses and too damaged by the Franklin losses to maneuver effectively in any other direction. For 2 weeks in December, the Confederate Army sat in the Tennessee cold, its numbers bleeding away through desertion, exposure, and the final stages of an attrition that had been running since the 7 days in 1862. On December 15th, Thomas attacked. The battle that followed over 2 days was less a battle than a systematic destruction. Thomas's well-organized assault hit the Confederate flanks on the first day and bent them back without breaking them, setting up a second-day attack that shattered the Confederate line entirely. The Army of Tennessee, which had entered the war as one of the most formidable fighting forces in North America, ceased to exist as an organized military formation on the afternoon of December 16, 1864. Men broke and ran. Officers could not stop them. Hood, on horseback among the retreating soldiers, reportedly wept. The retreat south continued for days in terrible weather, harassed by Union cavalry, with Hood unable to impose order on a force that had dissolved past the point where order was recoverable. He asked to be relieved of command in January 1865. The request was granted. What had happened to Hood was not simply that he had made bad decisions under pressure, though he had made several. The more precise explanation is that the qualities that made him exceptional at one level of command were the same qualities that made him catastrophically wrong for the level he was given. At the brigade and division level, aggression is a multiplier. A commander who will attack when others hesitate, who will spend his own blood to carry an objective, who drives men forward with the force of his own presence and his own refusal to accept defeat. That commander is enormously valuable in the specific context where tactical decisiveness matters most. Robert E. Lee saw it. Jefferson Davis saw it. What neither of them assessed carefully enough was whether Hood possessed the other qualities that Army command requires: the ability to coordinate multiple corps operating on separated axes across terrain that prevented direct communication, the ability to manage the political and logistical dimensions of a major campaign simultaneously with the tactical ones, the patience to wait for conditions to be right before attacking. When attacking early meant attacking badly, and the strategic judgment to distinguish between the situation as it actually was and the situation as he wished it to be. These were not qualities that showed up in the assault on Gaines's Mill or the breakthrough at Chickamauga. They were qualities that showed up, or didn't, when you were responsible for an entire army facing an opponent who had 4 months to study your tendencies before engaging you directly. Hood's personal life after the war was both successful and then suddenly devastating. He settled in New Orleans after the war, became a cotton factor and commission merchant, and rebuilt something approaching prosperity in the post-war economy of the Gulf South. He eventually married Anna Marie Hennon in 1868, not Buck Preston, who had definitively declined to marry him after Nashville, and the marriage was apparently a genuinely happy one. They had 11 children in 10 years, 3 sets of twins among them, a family large enough that Hood remarked, with whatever humor he retained, that he had made up for the men he had lost. In the summer of 1879, yellow fever moved through New Orleans as it had moved through the city before and would move through it again, a recurring disaster in an era before anyone understood how it spread or how to stop it. Hood's wife contracted the fever and died in August. One of his daughters died 3 days later. Hood himself fell ill the same week and died on August 30th, 1879, leaving 10 surviving children orphaned. He was 48 years old. The charitable organizations of New Orleans and the broader Confederate veterans community mobilized to provide for the children, and the memoirs Hood had been working on, a defense of his Tennessee campaign decisions that he titled Advance and Retreat, and that remains the most valuable primary source for understanding how Hood saw his own generalship, were published posthumously and used to raise funds for his children's care. He had spent the time between Nashville and his death, more than 14 years, working on that defense. The writing of it was not simply a professional exercise, it was an attempt to make sense of something that, in purely human terms, resisted sense. How an army that had been capable of breaking through the Union Center at Chickamauga, that had pursued a retreating enemy across Tennessee with genuine fighting power as late as the spring of 1864, had ended up as a broken column of men walking south in December sleet, trying to get far enough ahead of Union cavalry to stop and rest. Hood needed the book to answer that question as much as he needed it to answer it for anyone else. The book is combative, self-justifying in places, and revealing in ways that Hood probably did not fully intend. He blames Spring Hill on his corps commanders. He defends Franklin as strategically necessary. He argues that the Army of Tennessee was demoralized before he received it, and that its failures in Tennessee were rooted in the long retreat under Johnston. Some of these arguments have merit. Some of them don't hold up against the operational record. What they reveal collectively is a man who understood what had happened without quite being able to see clearly why, a man still fighting the campaign in his mind long after the army was gone. The assessment that military historians have reached about Hood over a century and a half of examination is not simple, and it shouldn't be. He was not a fool. He was not cowardly. He was not indifferent to the lives of his men, though his operational decisions consumed them at a rate that raises genuine questions about proportionality. He was a man of specific and genuine military gifts who was elevated beyond what those gifts could support, in circumstances that made the elevation almost inevitable, given what Davis needed from it. The veterans of the Army of Tennessee who survived Franklin and Nashville and lived to write about it tended to separate their admiration for Hood, the fighter, from their judgment about Hood, the Army commander, with a precision that is itself instructive. They admired what he had been. They were less certain about what he had been asked to be. A Texas veteran who had served under Hood since the Peninsula Campaign and made it home alive after Nashville wrote in a letter to his sister that Hood was the bravest man he had ever seen on a horse, that there was no officer in either army who would ride to the front of an assault with less apparent concern for what the enemy's rifles were doing, and that he wished, with a depth of feeling he found difficult to express in writing, that someone had found a different use for that bravery in the autumn of 1864. Robert E. Lee, asked after the war for his assessment of the generals who had served under him, said of Hood that he was a bold fighter, one of the best he had ever seen, but that he had feared what Hood would do with an independent command. It is the most precise summary of the man available. Bold fighters, at the level where boldness is the primary requirement, are rare and precious. The Civil War produced very few who matched Hood in that specific quality. The problem is that the specific quality that makes a bold fighter exceptional at the tactical level is not the same quality that the command of an army requires. And the Army of Tennessee learned that distinction at Spring Hill and Franklin and Nashville in the hardest way it could have been taught. John Bell Hood strapped himself to a horse and rode back to war after losing an arm's use and a leg, because that was who he was. The same character that produced that act of physical will produced Gaines's Mill and Chickamauga, and the same character produced Franklin. Courage and catastrophe in Hood's case were not opposites. They were expressions of the same thing, drawn from the same source, directed by the same will, shaped by the same refusal to accept that any objective was beyond reach. American military history offers very few figures who embodied that paradox as completely as John Bell Hood did, strapped to his saddle and riding forward.